Okay, thank you so much for joining us. This is the policy panel. A ton has happened this year as far as policy and plant-based products. Many states have introduced bills to prevent plant-based and cultured meat companies from calling their products meat, and these sorts of bills have been passed in quite a few states as well. So how did we get here? Let's meet our panel of experts. Anne, could you start off by introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Anne Veneman. I've done many things in my life, and today I'm doing kind of a portfolio of things, including some boards and so forth. But I also was the United States Secretary of Agriculture previously, and before that I was the California Secretary of Food and Agriculture for a period of time. So I think that's why I'm here.
I hate having to introduce myself after Anne. My name is Deepti Kulkarni. I am a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Sidley Austin, where I practice food and drug law. Prior to joining Sidley, I served for many years in the Office of Chief Counsel at the Food and Drug Administration, where I also worked on issues related to food and animal products.
And I'm Jaime Athos. I'm the CEO of the Tofurky company.
I'm Jessica Almy. I'm the Director of Policy at the Good Food Institute.
Great, thank you all for being here. Let's start by taking a step back for a moment and look at how we got into this environmental or political climate, what's driving these laws, and from what you told me, Anne, it's dairy. Could you explain how we got here?
Well, I think it's, first of all, I think it's interesting, as you said, to really look back, even since the last year when most of us were on this panel together this time last year. And we were still talking at that point around the issues of cell-based meat, who's going to regulate, is FDA going to have sole control, is USDA going to have a role, which arguably they should because of the fact that they have jurisdiction over meat and poultry inspection. Since over this past year, an agreement was reached between the USDA and the FDA, something that I thought was quite extraordinary given my many years in government, really laying out a framework to regulate cell-based product before it gets to the market. There's still a lot to do in terms of the regulatory structure, but I think that's significant. The second thing that happened, of course, is just recently, the cell-based companies have come together and formed an association, again, so that they speak with a unified voice, which I think with these new industries, it's very important that they do. And then finally, there's been this great group of laws that have been introduced, particularly at the state levels, on labeling issues around cell-based, around plant-based, what you can call it, and you'll hear more about all of these issues from the other panelists. But, you know, we've had plant-based milks for a number of years, and the dairy industry these days, and I think we saw some charts earlier today, is more and more feeling the pinch of dairy consumption going down, not overall dairy consumption as much as fluid milk consumption coming down. Much of it's made up in more cheese being eaten and yogurts and so forth. But they are now also pushing, particularly at the state legislature level, to do something about the plant-based products, the almond milks, the soys, the oat milks and so forth, that they cannot be called milk. So we've got this push now both on the dairy side and on the meat side, but we've obviously had these products for a number of years, and the issues are really being fought out in state legislatures, and I know many of them are now being challenged in the courts.
Yeah, and taking one step even further back, one thing a lot of these regulations are about is something called standards of identity. Deepti, could you explain, like, what does that mean?
Sure. So standards of identity are requirements in federal law under FDA statute and USDA statute. There are provisions that have allowed the federal government to establish standards of identity for food. Now, these provisions are old. They were some of the original provisions in the food labeling sections of these statutes, and they were in place before we had things like nutrition labeling and the internet and a lot of the claims that are being made on food today. The purpose of a standard was to prescribe a recipe of sorts so that a food manufacturer that wanted to use that term on the front of their food product had to meet that recipe. The goal was to prevent what people call economic adulteration, the use of perhaps ingredients that are of inferior quality, and other practices that could otherwise mislead consumers. And so we've had a lot of these standards in place since the 40s, 50s, some in the 60s. In the 70s and 80s, we started seeing a decline in the use of standards because we had other ways to convey information to consumers about foods, and we had a push to more innovative foods rather than to meet certain categories of foods. And some of the products that we're talking about today, because they date far back to early agriculture, industrial agriculture, particularly in the US, have these standards of identity, including milk. There's a standard of identity for a hamburger. There's a standard of identity for something called chopped steak. And so when you typically have a new food come onto the market, something you see frequently, and we've seen this for things like butter, certainly in the case of milk, even for yogurt, there's a thought process that if this newer product comes onto the market, can you argue it doesn't meet the standard of identity, and therefore it should not be allowed to bear the term that is subject to that standard? And because it's a requirement under federal law, it carries a fair bit of weight. And so you see a lot of people point to these standards when you have new foods coming to the market.
Yeah, so one really great example of that was Just Mayo. Maybe you could briefly explain what happened there.
Sure. So Just Mayo called itself just that. And mayo has a standard of identity. And in that standard, it says that mayonnaise has to include eggs. And of course, Just Mayo didn't include eggs. That was the whole point. And FDA issued a warning letter to the company, I think it was Hampton Creek at that time, asserting, among other things, that the product was purporting to call itself something that should have been subject to the requirements of a standard of identity, and specifically this product didn't have eggs in it. And so what you'll see now is not that Just Mayo isn't allowed to be called Just Mayo, but if you looked pretty carefully at the label, there will be a term on there that makes clear that the product is maybe something like a dressing or some other category that isn't mayo. And so that was the way that FDA and the company were able to reach an understanding that the product wasn't purporting to be something that's subject to a standard of identity. And a lot of people are looking to that example when they're thinking about things like cell-based meat and plant-based meat. Can you still be able to convey a message to your consumer about something related to that product using a term that might be within a standard of identity, but can you make clear that you're not purporting to be a food that's subject to that standard?
Great. So let's talk about now. Where are we right now when it comes to plant-based meat regulation and policy? Jessica, could you give us a lay of the land?
So the lay of the land is complex because, as Anne mentioned, there is a patchwork of state laws currently in effect. There were a number of bills that were introduced first in 2018 and then again this year that sought to restrict labeling. So those bills were intended to prevent companies like Jaime's from using terms like sausage or burger on their labels, even if those terms are accompanied by words like veggie, vegan, or plant-based, and the meaning is completely clear to consumers. So at the state level, we have variations in what the labeling law looks like. At the federal level, however, FDA has been mostly reasonable and has not chosen to strictly interpret and enforce these standards of identity that Deepti was talking about. In fact, if you look back to the standard of identity for milk, when it was established, it did define that milk is from the lacteal secretions of one or more healthy cows. So of course, that means goat's milk is out. But it also clarified that in that time, they were thinking about chocolate milk. It was only for the word milk when it doesn't have other words surrounding it that make the meaning clear to consumers, because obviously chocolate milk has chocolate and sugar added. It's not just lacteal secretion. And so the meaning of milk shouldn't be confined to only the lacteal secretions of a cow. The meaning is, the question should be whether the meaning is clear to consumers. And FDA overwhelmingly has been very reasonable, and the practice has been to allow compound names like almond milk or plant-based sausage to be on labels. And then, of course, we have the US Constitution. And Jaime will be able to talk more about the two cases that his company is involved in, that GFI is litigating together with ACLU and the Animal Legal Defense Fund. But the US Constitution, of course, is the controlling law. And if these state laws are found to be unconstitutional, then they will no longer be in force. And so that litigation is highly important.
And it might seem obvious, but why are these states trying to pass these laws?
So it's been really interesting. We've lobbied against these bills, and there's this veneer of consumer confusion. We want to make sure consumers understand what they're buying. But when they really get into the testimony, and if you look at the legislative histories of these bills, before they became law, it's very clear that it's about protecting certain industries in the states. And so in the litigation in both Missouri and Arkansas, we have evidence that the legislators intended to protect the cattle industries of those states from the newcomers. And Tofurky is not even that much of a newcomer, but from the perceived competition in order to protect the cattlemen in the states. And interestingly, in places like Arkansas and Louisiana, those laws were written very broadly to also protect to protect rice from cauliflower rice, because that was seen as an affront to the rice industries in those two states.
So Jaime, how are these laws impacting you and your business?
Well, there are two answers, I guess. One is not at all, because we're a mission-based company and we're seeking to do what's right. And I think what's right is you truthfully represent your products to consumers and you let them make informed choices. So we're doing that. But I think in the back of my mind, in the back of my family's mind, we're a family-owned company, is what is the legal risk that we're exposing ourselves to? These laws are worded so ambiguously that I don't know what the risk is. I don't know how I might comply with them and have confidence that I was absolutely in compliance with them. I think there are a lot of, the ambiguity leaves room for interpretation. There are a lot of people who are empowered and have authority to interpret and apply and enforce those laws also. And that's where it leaves us, uncertain, with fear and with this kind of sort of Damocles hanging over our head, not really knowing what the consequence would be. And wondering also, with 12 of these state laws having passed, how might one thread the needle with one kind of nomenclature strategy to comply with all of those laws?
And just to build on what Jaime was saying, in the state of Missouri, it's 110 county prosecutors who can decide whether they're going to bring an action against Jaime's company or many of the companies that are represented here in the audience. So even if you have 109 reasonable county prosecutors who say consumers aren't confused, there's still a very real risk of prosecution in a state like Missouri.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jaime, could you elaborate a little bit more on that ambiguity? Like what is ambiguous for you?
Well, I probably can't speak to the letter of what those laws say as much as how I've interpreted them. Sure. I think that depending on how narrowly you interpret them, misrepresenting your product as a meat product could come down to, is it colored to look like a meat product? Is it flavored? Is it textured? Is it in a format that's familiar or traditionally associated with a meat product? So that goes deeper than just the nomenclature. What do you call it? But I mean, it threatens really the right to put products that are not meat out into the marketplace potentially. I mean, that's a very kind of narrow reading, I guess, of how it might be interpreted. But again, there are a lot of opinions that might actually have a real impact on a business like mine. And I have to be realistic about how unreasonable they might be and what that might mean for my company.
And in the state of Arkansas, it's unlawful now to use a term that has conventionally been used to represent an agricultural product for any other reason, any other use. So what does that mean? What is the tradition of various agricultural terms? You know, they meant to protect beef and rice, but of course that's written so broadly that no person of reasonable intelligence can interpret it.
And let's say hypothetically it was clear what you had to do, that you had to relabel everything in these states. I mean, how much would that cost you? Like, how challenging would that be?
I think there are a lot of different scenarios to contemplate there. Let's say that's a simple situation, that we just have to change our labeling for a national product and has to comply with all of these various state laws. That would probably cost us about $1 million. I think that's a reasonable estimate of that. Another scenario might be that you have laws that are completely incompatible and you have to consider, do we distribute one package or one product type in one region and a different one in another one? That comes down to a pretty challenging logistical question. And the costs there, I think, are even greater and even harder to calculate. But what really ends up happening in that scenario is you start making decisions based upon what is the opportunity. Let's say that Arkansas, we've decided that we can comply in all the other states but Arkansas. The smart business decision ultimately is to just not release your products in Arkansas. And ultimately that means that the actions of the legislature are just depriving their constituents of access to foods that they want. We're not forcing people to buy Tofurky. We're not coercing them or deceiving them into buying Tofurky. They want these things. And I think just as a citizen, that offends my sensibilities. I think ultimately the actions of government should empower consumers. We should make sure that they're being spoken to accurately and that they're getting good information, but we shouldn't limit their choices. That seems to be undemocratic to me.
So you're fighting back. Could you tell us about your lawsuit?
So yeah, lawsuits, multiple.
Lawsuits.
So the first one, we're a co-plaintiff with GFI in Missouri, represented by the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and with the support of our whole industry. And honestly, we're taking this fight on behalf of the industry. This isn't about Tofurky. If we were offered a situation where Tofurky had a pass and we were told that we were in absolute compliance, we could do whatever we wanted, we'd say no to that. That's not a compromise we're willing to take. We've been in this industry now for about 40 years. We feel a little bit territorial about the opportunity that we've created for a lot of other companies. And our mission is ultimately not about Tofurky making money or selling lots of products. It's about changing the food system and helping to improve the world ultimately. And then in addition to Missouri, we're also there are plaintiffs in Arkansas as well. And then indirectly, Tofurky is one of the founding board members of the Plant-Based Foods Association, which is a plaintiff in a lawsuit in Mississippi as well.
Yeah, Jessica, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think it's really interesting. So the two lawsuits that Tofurky is the lead plaintiff on are Animal Legal Defense Fund and the ACLU. So we have free speech being represented, and the main claim is that it violates the First Amendment, although there are other constitutional challenges as well. The one that the Plant-Based Foods Association is a plaintiff in with Upton's Naturals has been brought by the Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian free market law firm. So I think this is a very interesting issue where people who care about free speech and people who care about free markets come together. It seems the only people who disagree are the people who pass these laws.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about cultured meat or cell-based meat. And had mentioned earlier that there's a regulatory framework. Deepti, could you explain what is that going to look like?
Sure. I'd love to take a step back and talk about what happened over the course of the last year, because it truly is unprecedented, and the evolution of the regulatory framework and the accelerated pace with which we've seen change is really phenomenal. I know I've never seen anything like it, and I think it demonstrates both the promise in this technology and also the significant interest that it's garnered. So what happened over the course of the last year? So in February of last year, a petition was filed with USDA asking the agency to prohibit the use of some of the terms that we've talked about today in labeling of products that aren't harvested from traditional livestock or traditional cattle. Then we saw legislative proposals seeking to give USDA and USDA alone oversight over cell-cultured or cell-based meat. And then in June, FDA announced that it was holding a public hearing regarding foods derived from animal cell culture technology under FDA's very broad food authority. Food is generally defined as something that is used as food, which is a very helpful definition from Congress. That meeting happened in July, and a lot of observers said USDA wasn't at this meeting. What does that mean? A USDA spokesperson said, we don't know why FDA is having this kind of meeting without us being involved. We regulate meat and poultry. And then in August, Memphis Meats and the North American Meat Institute sent a letter to the administration requesting regulatory clarity with respect to this issue under longstanding pre-existing authorities, whereby FDA would have oversight over pre-market activities, and USDA would have oversight over things like process inspections and labeling, which happens today when you add ingredients to meat and poultry already. Then we had our conference in San Francisco, and we were here talking about what was going to happen. Was USDA going to regulate? Was FDA going to regulate? Was this joint framework going to happen? And then days after our conference, USDA and FDA announced that they would have a joint meeting to talk about this issue. It was a 2-day meeting, and before that was a 1-day meeting at FDA on science-related issues. That happened in October. And then in November, the agencies announced that they would regulate under a joint framework whereby FDA would have pre-market oversight over the products, and USDA would have oversight thereafter post-harvest. And then in March of this year, the agencies issued a framework under something called a joint agreement describing the details of that regulatory framework. Under that framework, again, USDA would look at things like FDA would look at things like pre-market safety, cell collection, cell banking, cell proliferation, and then post-harvest, USDA would have oversight over things like processing and labeling. So a lot of questions have been answered, including who would be regulated, how, and by whom. But what hasn't been answered are things like labeling, which we've talked about, and some technical details regarding how the agencies will work together to regulate these products. So still some open questions, but nowhere near where we were last year.
But I think it's important to also point out that a lot of this happened and came together because Memphis Meats, as one of their original hires, hired somebody who had a longstanding tenure in FDA. And unlike the Just Mayo example that we talked about earlier, where regulation wasn't really considered as the product was being developed and put to the market, I think the lesson in all of this is that it's very important with these new products to really have a handle on how they're going to be regulated so that you don't have difficulty down the line when you're about to put it on the market. And I think that's where the cell-based industries today coming together in this coalition, they're going to continue to work on these issues. But I think it'll benefit everyone in the long term, both the traditional industries as well as the up-and-coming and new industries that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. It's better to be working with the regulators to chart your pathway to commercialization than working against, because you have to work with them and through the life cycle of your product. It doesn't end just when you get on market.
And as far as the framework goes, do we know where cell-based seafood falls into that?
Oh, it's a good question. So FDA and USDA, with respect to how seafood is regulated, FDA is the primary regulator of seafood with the exception of catfish, another issue that we could talk about for hours. So under that pre-existing authority, seafood would predominantly be regulated by USDA unless there's a cell-based catfish maker out there, in which case
You
you
mean
should find
FDA?
one of us.
Primarily regulated by FDA.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I meant FDA.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think what's interesting about the formal agreement is it says that FDA and USDA are going to try to harmonize what they're doing. And so I think it's what happens when you're looking at USDA labeling. It won't be the same process because FDA labeling is a different process than USDA. USDA, you need pre-market approval of your labels if they're branded. And they will be for this. But the basic requirements should be harmonized across the two agencies. And we do have this wild food regulatory system in the United States where it's bifurcated between these two agencies, and they don't always harmonize what they're doing. So it will be very interesting to see what that harmonization looks like for the cell-based or cultivated meat industry.
And one point I'd love to make off of the very good point Jessica just made is not only is this in the formal agreement that the agencies should harmonize with one another, but this is a requirement under USDA statute. So if you were to look at USDA statute, the Poultry Product Inspection Act and the Meat Inspection Act, Federal Meat Inspection Act, there's a provision in there that talks about establishing standards of identity, which I know there's been a lot of talk about related to cell-based meat, that talks about the need for consultation from FDA, by USDA with FDA. And so if we're establishing standards of identity or seeking to do so in the USDA space, federal law requires a consultation between the two and some level of consistency.
So we know some cell-based meat companies are ready to roll. They're just waiting for the stamp of approval. Based on what you've seen so far, when do you think that might happen? Totally speculating here, obviously. Educated guess.
Is anyone going to touch that? I don't know.
I think it's maybe a question you want to ask of the panel tomorrow afternoon, and you have the CEOs of all the companies.
So I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. First one. Does the FDA consider non-American regulators? Should the industry look primarily to the US or elsewhere for guidance on future regulation?
Oh, that's a great question.
I think it's more likely that other countries will be looking to the US than the inverse. But I do think there's, just as we're talking about harmonizing between FDA and USDA, I think there's a real need to harmonize the safety requirements across jurisdictions. So I think there is a need for a common safety dossier that could be used to demonstrate safety to the American regulators as well as regulators in places like Singapore, India, and Israel.
Right. So you're saying we are the furthest along right now, right? But there's other countries that are moving quickly?
Well, the process is clear in Europe. There's a novel foods regime in Europe, and there's a regulation that talks about how cell-based meat or cultivated meat might move through that process. But we haven't seen anybody submit an application yet.
Got it. What is the role for environmental, animal welfare, and health NGOs to help advocate for a regulatory level playing field in advanced plant-based food industries?
I'll take that one again. I think this is really amazing. I mean, you have this nonprofit community that is so eager to support these two industries. I don't think that's something you see very often. And I think the Good Food Institute is somewhat unique among nonprofits, that we really do exist to leverage markets and innovation to create a better future of food for the United States and globally. And so I think there is a really important role that nonprofits have particularly in talking to their colleagues. So there has been a push against food innovation, a fear of food technology that has been advanced by some nonprofits. And I think that they're more likely to listen to their colleagues at allied organizations than they are to the industry and really trust the industry. So, these industries hold the promise of feeding a growing world population without the antibiotics, without any use, significant use of animals in a meaningful way, without putting the same impact on resources. And so it's really important for nonprofits to be mobilizing and to be calling for a level playing field when it comes to labeling, when it comes to ensuring safety of these products. All these industries are asking for is to be able to compete and let consumers decide who wins.
Jessica, I suspect this one might go to you as well. Can someone address federal preemption in the context of the individual state nomenclature exclusion laws?
Oh, what a great question. There's a lawyer in this audience somewhere. I'll give a stab and then Deepti, if you want to jump in.
Sure.
So preemption is not a claim in the cases that GFI has brought with Tofurky. But I think preemption is a really interesting question when it comes to, cultivated meat, because clearly USDA and FDA are working together to ensure the safety. USDA is regulating this meat from livestock and poultry species under its authority with the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act. And both of those federal laws very clearly say that states cannot pass labeling laws for meat. And so what does that mean in the context of cell-based? It means that those laws are very clearly preempted by existing statutes. But all of the litigation right now is on the plant-based side, and First Amendment is the lead claim in all of the lawsuits that are pending right now. So I would expect to see, if we see other litigation move forward, you might see preemption claims. But we win on First Amendment anyway.
Deepti, did you want to say anything?
I think Jessica covered it nicely. I think, the FMIA and PPIA, whoever the lawyer that asked this question, there are express preemption provisions in those statutes, and so you can argue that you've got clear preemptive effect. Typically, you need a federal requirement to point to, and so I think Jessica's absolutely right about the strength of those preemption provisions. And I think we'll need to keep our eyes peeled about what's happening on the federal level, particularly with respect to labeling of these products and the preemptive effect thereafter.
So I think this next question is very interesting. Should plant-based or cell-based meat be allowed to access labels like certified humane?
That is interesting.
Well, they're obviously humane.
It's interesting, I think, especially when we think about cell-based meat, depending on where what cells they're getting from which animals. Like, I know Just is getting cattle cells from Kobe beef. So do they get to call that Kobe beef as well, even though it's not massaged in the same way? I feel like in ways this is more of a philosophical question. That no one has opinions on. All right. All right. And maybe you could field this one. Is there a conflict of interest with the USDA since they have a mission to advance animal agriculture?
Well, I think we heard a lot of those kinds of conversations last year when there was a discussion about should USDA have a role in regulating this. And I think the law is fairly clear that USDA has regulatory authority over meat and poultry inspection. I mean, food safety for USDA in the area over which they have jurisdiction is critically important to protect the consumer. And, that is first and foremost above all else in that part of USDA. So yes, USDA does work with industries. It administers everything from, the marketing orders, the promotion authorities and so forth. But the food safety is preeminent, and I don't believe that anything will undermine what their authority is under the Meat and Poultry Inspection Act. That's a separate agency within USDA, and as we were talking about, they work closely with FDA. The reason food safety is so important to the food industry is if there's one bad player, the whole industry loses. And so the industry wants a strong food safety system.
Going back to the standards of identity issue, Miracle Whip can't be called mayo due to standards of identity, but that hasn't hurt sales. Why is alternative meat different? If it's good, why would it matter?
Oh, I have not had Miracle Whip in a long time. I mean, so, you know, the use of a standard of identity argument when you've got a new player in the market is a common theme. I would have to go back and think about the history for Miracle Whip, but you know, when you have a new product or a new category of products that has the potential to take as much market share as I think some folks think will happen here, that's when you have more of an incentive to make these types of arguments. And I don't want to suggest that all of the arguments are frivolous. Sometimes products truly don't meet standards of identity and they are requirements under the law. So maybe not knowing the Miracle Whip history, maybe that wasn't the pinch that was felt. I do want to say one thing about butter. You know, butter is not only defined in a regulation, but it's defined in a statute. That's how much we as Americans care about butter. And we have things like peanut butter on the market, which I think GFI pointed to in a petition that they filed on this issue. And peanut butter and peanut spread are subject to a standard of identity and a common or usual name. And so it's not unusual, I think, as Jessica mentioned earlier, to see this progression of products and these use of terms to make clear that the new product is not claiming or purporting to be subject to the standard of identity. And I think that's a really key point here with respect to these products like Tofurky and others that are using, you know, clear language about the source of the protein in those products.
Yeah, and it's not just peanut butter. Rye bread does not meet the standard of identity for bread. Rice noodles do not meet the standard of identity for noodles. I mean, the whole supermarket is arguably in violation of these standards of identity. But I think the question really gets to why is it important? And I think at some point when you get enough market share, I think Miracle Whip, people know what it is. They know how they're going to use it. There's not a question there. And, you know, maybe we've reached that point for some market segments. Maybe people understand almond milk well enough that we could call it anything and they would know to pour it over their cereal and put it in their coffee. But let me ask you this, what are we going to call Tofurky sausage if we can't use the word sausage? I mean, the Tofurky sausage tells you what that's going to taste like, how you're going to cook it, where, you know, what kind of occasion you're going to serve it in. We can't call it a finger or a tube or a roll. Who's going to buy a Tofurky roll? You're going to think it's a fluffy bakery product, or a tube is like the London Underground. I mean, these terms don't have any real meaning for consumers. So the question is, why are we going to allow standards of identity to get in the way of companies like Jaime's talking directly to consumers, making clear what they're selling, and the consumer with full understanding engages in that transaction? That's just protectionism. If our judge is in the audience, I hope you're clapping.
Jaime, now I'm curious, are tube and roll possibilities for sausage if you have to rename it?
Well, we're working on a project behind the scenes. Hear about it. No, I think I'm a layperson here. I don't really understand these regulations to the degree that the other panelists do. But I think ultimately Jessica hit the nail on the head. We want to communicate to our consumers what they're buying. And our business it's built on repeat business. If we deceive somebody one time into buying our products, that's not a sustainable business for us. We have to tell them what they're going to get, but also inspire them in terms of what they might do with that. A lot of our consumers are omnivores, flexitarians. Maybe they're transitioning to a more permanent sort of vegan diet, but they need to understand how to use these products. Maybe they've got a favorite recipe and they're looking for another protein source for it. That's all we're trying to do. I think ultimately, regardless of what the regulations say, I think that when you try to be honest and you try to inform your consumers accurately, then the regulation should conform with that situation instead of inhibiting it. And I think that's what these new state laws are doing. It's like potentially preventing us from using very accurate terminology that helps people contextualize how these things might fit into their own dietary habits and choices and traditions.
And one other example in this conversation I'll just bring in is Perfect Days ice cream, where they ferment fungi and then make ice cream that's identical to the real thing, but they're calling it frozen dairy desserts to not ruffle any feathers. But it sold out in a day.
Yep.
Is there any concern about relaxing labeling regulations to the point where bad actors are able to mislead customers?
Absolutely not. No. No, it's against federal law to deceive consumers. I mean, and Deepti can talk to this in more detail, and Anne from your experience, but there is nothing that is happening right now that undermines that fundamental principle that if you lie to a consumer, you can't keep that product on the market. FDA is going to crack down on you, or USDA is going to come after you. And that foundational bedrock principle is not at all in danger of being chipped away by allowing food innovation.
Is there any type of precedence with how GMO labeling has been handled, and what are the implications for plant and cell-based meats?
So I think a lot of people think about the, GMO or products developed using biotechnology evolution when they think about this technology, and I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. There, you've seen a progression of products that, can actually solve a lot of problems, but the way in which the benefits were conveyed to consumers were probably conveyed not to consumers like the folks that are purchasing the foods, but to the farmers that were using those types of products. And I think the difference here is that the value proposition for the products and the things that we care about so much that we came to this conference, they are going to be conveyed to the consumer. And so I hope, is that extension, that description of all of the benefits that Jessica and Jaime and folks before us have described help consumers understand the technology in a way that didn't happen with bioengineering or hasn't happened fully. And we've seen state efforts related to bioengineering as well that ultimately resulted in a federal statute with strong preemption provisions. And the hope is that we're beyond that for cell-based meat and for plant-based meat because we have these longstanding federal statutes in place with preemption provisions. But really, the true hope is that consumers will appreciate and want the technology because they understand the benefit to themselves, the benefit to the environment, and to animals.
Yeah, I also think that the whole area of GMO, all of the desire to label GMO, to have a non-GMO label, whatever. I mean, I think there's a lot of consumer confusion.
Yes.
Organics do not include GMO. So if you don't want a GMO, you can buy an organic and you will be assured of having non-GMO. And yet you see so many things that are labeled organic, non-GMO. Or I love the fact that they have all of these things in the grocery store that have never had a GMO product, version of the product, like orange juice. There is not a GMO orange, and yet they label it non-GMO. So in some ways, they're using these labels to get a consumer acceptance when it really isn't conveying something that's, distinguishable from one kind of product to another. One brand of product to the other.
Or non-GMO salt.
Non-GMO salt.
When did salt have any DNA? So. Minor details, yeah.
Is the meat industry backing off of its labeling offensive as major meat companies like Tyson become more invested in plant-based products?
I'd say it's hard for me to agree to that, given that we're in the midst of this lawsuit, and I don't think there's a challenge to the other 8-9 states that have passed laws like this as well. So the signs from where I sit are that no, they're not backing off at this point.
So I don't think it's coming from the meat processors like Tyson's. I think it's coming from the grassroots. In almost every state in this country, cattle are produced. And many of the cattle producers, I would say most, are fairly small small producers. And their organizations, their state organizations, feel very threatened by some of these new technologies. Rural communities are threatened. They see what's happening with some of the agricultural, trade right now has reduced agriculture incomes. Many of our farmers are very, very impacted by the trade wars right now. And I think these efforts at the state level are really coming from the grassroots producers, not the meat companies.
I think Ann is absolutely right, and I would add that it's really a travesty that, in light of the way that farmers in rural communities are suffering, the response has been to censor the competition. That's a meaningless response by these legislators. They need to do more for their communities.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you all for being here, for submitting great questions. Thank you for your expertise.